Well, I'm going to be talking about Web3 and kind of talking about it at a high level. Some of this you will know. In fact, some of this, everybody will know a piece of this, but I hope no one has thought about it quite this way. So let's see. So first, quick background on me, co-founder of Fluence, which is where we're here talking about, but I'm also on the board of Stronghold Digital Mining, which is a environmentally beneficial Bitcoin miner listed on the NASDAQ, and I helped found and put together Hedera Hashgraph HBAR, which is an enterprise-grade blockchain governed by enterprises. So this is kind of the map of what we want to talk about quickly, which is why peer-to-peer, and then kind of how peer-to-peer, and why not blockchain. Because peer-to-peer is not the same as blockchain. I want to talk about that because that gets conflated a lot. And then open source is the answer for those Web 2. That's more targeted to you. The Web 3 people, that's probably pretty self-explanatory. And then how does crypto fit in? And that's maybe this audience understands that pretty well given the blockchain component. So first I want to talk about big tech censorship. And so if you have paid attention to the news, you've seen more and more stories about the totalitarian governments really clamping down on dissent via the large technology platforms. And so we've arrived at an internet that has consolidated into primarily one social platform, primarily one search engine, primarily a handful of hosting providers, and that has basically been a convenient place for totalitarian governments primarily to exert influence and censorship. And so a lot of examples of your kind of the neighboring country from where we are right now, censoring not only a political opponent Navalny, but also Google taking applications off that allow people, that kind of help people vote. Also, this clearly happens in China quite substantially. But what's interesting, it doesn't just happen in totalitarian governments. India is the largest democracy in the world, and India has had made significant headlines by exerting extreme pressure on Twitter and also WhatsApp, threatening executives with jail if they didn't comply with taking down the accounts of opposition politicians or just accounts that were providing narratives counter to what the government wanted. And this goes beyond even governments in their own countries. China has long been very sensitive about the Tiananmen Square episode, and Microsoft, claimed inadvertently to ban images related to that incident in countries other than China, like Germany and the UK and France, and they claim that was human error. We're not sure, obviously, if that's the case or not, but it just shows that the censorship extends quite beyond just these countries. Beyond censorship, though, there also is a real stranglehold from an infrastructure perspective. And so 60% of the web is estimated to be hosted by Amazon, Google, and by Microsoft Azure. So that's the 60% of the cloud, and I guess that's not 60% of the web, but 60% of the cloud, which is a lot of the web, is hosted by those companies. And they're growing revenue at about 50% a year. To grow revenue at 50% a year, you've got to be doing something very right or very wrong. And they are clearly doing that because they're providing a service that people like, but they also have provided something that's very hard to leave. And so these proprietary platforms are very difficult to get out of once you're into them. And the data isn't easily transportable. You have a difficult time moving from one to the other. And as an example of this data is a little bit old, but Lyft pays estimates about 14 cents per ride to AWS. That's about how high their hosting costs are, which is substantial. And so small companies, it's a big benefit because they can enter into these ecosystems without the upfront cost of actually developing all this code themselves in the back-end infrastructure. And big companies like Samsung, which quite publicly has extricated themselves from AWS, have the resources to do that. If you're stuck in the middle, you have a real difficult time. And one example here of the control they exert is a social media network that had 2.3 million users that AWS shut off for a terms of service violation. This is Parler, and we may not like Parler's politics, and they're clearly not, by no stretch are they providing the good for the world that, say, Chinese dissidents are, I would argue. But it's still remarkable that a business of that size can be shut down with no warning and no redress for a terms of service violation. And that just shows the power that these companies have and that they exert. And so even if you don't think you have any risk of being shut down because you're not, you know, allowing some kind of negative content on your site, if you're an executive, you can't help but be aware of this power that these centralized hosting providers can exert over your business. And just knowing that can change your actions. And if this centralized infrastructure resulted in flawless execution, but centralized infrastructure leads to vulnerabilities, and that's what centralization, that's a problem with centralization, right? You have benefits of scale, but also risks of scale. And I think all of us experienced the WhatsApp and Facebook outage of at this point, it's a couple months ago. And that's, you know, for me and for others, I guess it's been an inconvenience. But there's plenty of businesses in the world, particularly in emerging markets, that rely on WhatsApp to perform their daily functions. And there are even government and agencies, again, in you know, outside of some of the Western world, that really rely on these platforms. And so when those actually go down, that has real world implications and real world issues. That's not the first time these things have gone down. They go down both because of, and can go down for malicious intent, but also just because of human error and failures. And that's what happens when you have centralized systems. They are vulnerable to either they're tempting attack targets, and they're vulnerable to mistakes. And we see this again and again and again with these platforms. And is this the internet we signed up for? Tim Berners-Lee's internet, and the sort of the real architect of the web, this was most assuredly not what he had in mind. His innovation was this hyperlink protocol that allowed the sharing of any type of information, any type of format of information via hyperlinks, with the goal of democratizing access and allowing voices kind of all over the world to be heard. And that, to a large extent, has happened. But the problem is that scale, the internet rewards scale, and as users, we like convenience. And so when you have users, that gets you more revenue. You then can market more, make a slicker UI, get more users, and that flywheel is very hard to beat. And then on top of that, we'd rather not go to 10 different websites to buy things. We'd rather not go to 10 different search engines. And that's just human nature. So the problem is we have a web that has developed both because of economics and because of human nature kind of convenience to these dominant providers. And that's left us in a rather precarious position. On top of it, big companies historically always interact with governments. You go back to the East India Company in Holland, right? They were integrated with the government more or less. You go back to IBM, it was with, you know, it was tight with government. Railroads were in the US, right? So telcos, clearly. So whenever companies get big, they have to interact with government and vice versa. And if they don't, they can be really targeted by governments, and then shareholders revolt, throw out the management, new management will come in, that will then, you know, toe the government line. And so you end up with these, but the difference now is you have these businesses that have much more broad impact in our worlds than just transport or import or commerce. There's media, and there's all kinds of interaction that they can dominate. And there's never been kind of riskier or more consequential businesses for governments to have control over. And so how did we get here? You know, we started off in the world of mainframes and desktops. Everybody's kind of familiar with this, Web 1.0. And that kind of started everything. And then kicking and screaming, people moved to the cloud platforms. And originally people thought, well, gee, I want to host my own data. It's cheaper, it's more secure. And then everyone realized, actually, maybe the cloud is cheaper. Maybe it's not my core business. I should outsource this. So over 20 years, people moved to the cloud platform. And I remember I was actually invested in web data centers back in the late 90s, and it was a struggle to get companies to move on to them. Fast forward, and these are the biggest, most profitable businesses in the world, pretty much. Well, what's the future? It's peer-to-peer platforms. And peer-to-peer platforms are the next generation of the web, and they are, I think, inevitable, and frankly, we need to have them. But why are they inevitable? Because they have better scalability, higher security, and better resilience. And so there's no centralized bottlenecks, single points of failure, and they're much more censorship resistant. So let's go into each one of these. So peer-to-peer can scale faster. And why is that? Because it's decentralized open architecture. So it's effectively a marketplace of hardware hosting. So when there's demand for lots of hosting, pricing goes up. What does that mean? People around the world can contribute hardware. What does that do? Drives prices down. So there's no company that can react as fast as a global marketplace to meet demand needs. And so I think anyone in a peer-to-peer infrastructure world can contribute hardware to the network, and the price of those resources and the price of it will obviously respond to that addition of resources. And so you also have a precisely kind of infinite precision in terms of pricing, where people that want incredibly high resilience in multiple locations, multiple geographies can pay for it. Someone that wants something very simple can just pay a small amount for that. It's also censorship resistant. Applications hosted on a peer-to-peer network don't depend on one owner. Any author can host. They can run anywhere. And one thing that's less talked about on the censorship resistant side is the infiltration of existing platforms by government security services. And one data point we have on this is that either Saudi security forces or infiltrated, or else Twitter employees were just co-opted into selling the identities of activists in Saudi to the Saudi government, and those activists ended up imprisoned, as did some of the people that they communicated with. I can't imagine this is the first time this has happened, and it certainly won't be the last. And so in a peer-to-peer environment where code is open source, the security is visible for everybody to see, you have far better protections. And I think that is something which will be pretty interesting to see. Also, obviously, in peer-to-peer open application environment, there are no legal entity to compel, no management to threaten, no directors to pressure, and no shareholders to worry about. And peer-to-peer is no centralized, obviously, failure points. Applications can live on the network, can be hosted by any number of individual or institutional providers, and there's no particular reliance on a particular hardware or connectivity provider, and the code is open source and reliable. And what this means is we may end up in a world of one browser as well, but let's hope it's something like Brave or something that's open source, so you can see it, you understand how the algorithms work, and people can opine and edit and change and move them, and it doesn't happen in an opaque environment. And same with a shopping algorithm, or same with the social media algorithm for sure. And so what type of traction do we have in peer-to-peer? Well, we have traction in payments, right? That's Bitcoin, it's Ethereum, it's all the crypto everyone here knows, in blockchain. That is a big market, right? It's over 2.5, almost 3 trillion right now, and tens of billions of dollars a day. So I think it's safely say that peer-to-peer payments is functioning. And then storage. Our lovely, terrific co-hosts here as well have demonstrated and blazed the path in terms of decentralized storage. That is clearly functioning, and the numbers are very large in terms of what's hosted, and that is on a trajectory straight upward. And so those two pieces are solved. But the piece that hasn't yet been solved is the compute piece, and that's the red piece at the bottom. And when you have a compute engine and you add that to storage and you add it to payments, you now have a disaggregated cloud competitor. And you can put those three things together, and you really have a viable alternative to the cloud for the first time. And so that peer-to-peer compute, and by the way, this is where I'm going to go, doesn't have to be on-chain. And I think a lot of people, particularly in the blockchain Web3 space, have assumed it has to be on-chain, but it doesn't, and I'm going to talk about it in a second. But first, why now? And it's because I think we're at a time where the technology has evolved to actually allow this, and we can talk about what Fluence is built that actually shows this is functioning. But you also have the awareness at a pretty much all-time high of censorship and of self-sovereign identity importance and of personal data ownership. And I think people now have seen that, and the Web3 movement has made it very clear that there is a really core group of people very concerned about these issues and ready to do the effort to adopt it. That wasn't the case 5 years ago, right? Was it the case a year ago or 2 years ago? Yes, but it's grown substantially, and I think we'll continue to. And this is just a quick point that the Web3 applications don't have to be blockchain based. All right, we think of them as being peer-to-peer, and peer-to-peer is not synonymous with blockchain. And if you think about blockchain in general, consensus overhead is generally high, and obviously there are layer 2 solutions, and there's solutions like Hedera that are far faster and cheaper, but it's still, most applications don't require that consensus, but you ideally have an application that if you need consensus and you want that trustlessness, you can plug it in and use it, but by default, you don't require it. I'm going to be quick on the open source bit here. Open source is the answer. I hope that isn't too much of a controversial statement here. If this was a traditional crypto conference, I don't think I'd even have to have these slides. But given we are at Slush and there's a lot of proprietary technology here, I'll just mention for a second. Just a fun thing to talk about, which is Brooks' Law, which is kind of a fun thing, which is that if you have a software project which is late and you add engineers to it, you make it later. And that's really a function of the communication overhead, which when you have a team, every person you add to that team, the communication increases by the square of that addition, sort of a reverse of kind of Metcalfe's law. But anyway, so that's why we've seen the complexity of centralized systems being built. And so, I've taken this from Eric Raymond's The Cathedral and the Bazaar being the way in which the terrific code being built in all these platforms that everyone knows and uses, I hope. But open source, despite being terrific, has an issue in terms of monetization. And so we, in some sense, are in the golden age of open source monetization with 15 publicly traded worth over $1 billion. But there's two models. One is you're open source, but you have hosting, and people pay you to host the open source. What that means as a CEO, you have to build all of this hosting infrastructure, and that's complicated. It has nothing to do with the software code you're writing. The other open source monetization is this consulting kind of enterprise integration model, where you hire a whole team of salespeople and a whole team of developers, and you run around talking to your clients and telling them how to tweak this issue, make it specific to them for this, and you can do that, but also now you're hiring teams and paying them, and it's incredibly complex and has nothing to do with your core business of building software. And so even with those terrific successes in the open source world, 90+% of projects still struggle for funding and are reliant on grants and donations. And so, and even companies that are open source and do monetize, the cloud still takes their code, puts it on their system, and charges for it. And so MariaDB, I've heard an estimate that MariaDB thinks that Amazon gets about $1 billion of revenue from MariaDB. That's just one, open source database company. And so that's what these clouds do. So innovation suffers because all these businesses require cloud services, and there's no way to really get them easily outside of this. So what a better model is the Fluence model. And so what Fluence does is it has this peer-to-peer network, right, of nodes that host code. Completely open network where anyone can join the network or leave the network. And then that takes place of the marketplace dynamics I was referencing earlier. And then we have a programming language called Aqua, which is the first language for peer-to-peer workflows and applications that allows native composition of peer-to-peer applications. And that allows easy composition of applications, which is, makes life obviously much simpler for developers. But the last piece, which ties into open source, which is critical, is that when code is uploaded to Fluence, there is a potential for the authors to share in hosting revenue. And so this is our attempt to drive an ecosystem and to actually reward developers. So let me explain how this works. So if you write a module or some open source code, you upload it onto Fluence, and you have with that a payment that you will request or is conditional for a host that hosts your code to pay you. Importantly, if they host it, this isn't a donation, it's not a grant, and it is paid based on use. If no one uses your code, you don't get anything. If people use it, the host via smart contract, automatically some portion of his hosting revenue goes to you. We don't think this will cause open source developers to buy boats and airplanes, but there'll be but there will be revenue that will be generated from this, which will support open source developers. And so there is plenty of margin in hosting for some small piece of it to go on a seamless fashion to the original host. Now, could people copy this code and host it for free because it's open source? Yes, but we think that's not unlike kind of check marks in Twitter. They'll be the host will get value from having verified, authenticated modules that come from the original author. And so the end users will only see the hosting fee. They'll just compare hosting fees like they do on current platforms right now. And when they pay that, some piece will go to the original software author, some of which can be monetized. And so we think this leads to an incredibly interesting ecosystem where more developers put code on Fluence. That then leads to more unique and interesting applications that are possibly built on Fluence, which leads to more people using Fluence, which leads to more code being posted on Fluence. And ultimately, you get a innovation cycle that no centralized company can beat. AWS could pull whatever they want, right, and host and charge for anything they want because it's open source, but they won't be able to operate at the speed and depth of the global developer community. And so that's what we're very excited about. And how does crypto fit in? Well, 3 ways. Payment allows, and this again, I'm guessing in this audience, I don't have to, tell how great crypto is. It's some other audiences that is a little bit different, but immediate trackable transactions, no minimums. But really thinking about this, if you're hosting in, pick your country, I don't know, maybe you're writing code in Senegal and the host is in the US and the user is in Europe, what currency you're going to use. And you can maybe denominate in dollars. As an American, I can't help but mention that, and that seems fine to me. But paying for that, well, you can use a credit card, bank statement, depending on the payments, that's difficult. Do you have chargebacks? Are you taking credit risk? With crypto, you can do this immediately with no counterparty risk in almost limitless denominations. And I think that is why crypto is the future for payments, as I think most people here would understand. It also helps for governance. And Fluence and others are governed by a DAO. That means if you own a coin, you have a vote. And that's democratic and inclusive and allows people to help govern this protocol, have an ownership in it, and actually participate in its success as well. And that is also unusual and different from most other traditional models. And even if some of that governance is corrupted, because open source, people can govern it even outside of it, so that if there's multiple levels of protections built into it when you have this type of model. And then finally, crypto helps from funding perspective, because the DAO has a treasury. And the more people think a project is successful, the higher value the treasury would be. That provides more value to give developer grants, to encourage the ecosystem, encourage building. The more building, the more likely the success of the project and the protocol is, the higher their value there is in the DAO, the more there is to fund, and you get another virtuous cycle going on as well. So that's also very hard to beat. So that is that wheel, which you've seen before. So where do we think this leaves us? Well, peer-to-peer is the future, and we think that compensation for open source really works when it's based on use and when it's a kind of a transparent funding mechanism that people really don't even need to see or to pay for explicitly. And the protocol that can enable this type of infrastructure, maybe it's Fluence, maybe it's not, maybe someone else figures out a better model, but someone that figures this out will create a global network and a global developer ecosystem that no centralized company can compete with. And when you do this, by the way, things that will be built that we can't imagine, because the amount of modules, the amount of people working to build interoperable code and projects will allow a level of innovation that we, I think, have difficulty imagining. And so I'll close with just a question about what kind of world do we want? Do we want 3 companies really controlling internet hosting? And do we want content monitored and controlled by nation states with huge barriers to building anything independently? I don't think so. That's definitely not the model I don't think any of us want. And so peer-to-peer open source and crypto economics is pretty much the only chance we have and the only architecture that can compete with these centralized, dominant companies right now. That's it. There's no other way I can think of to compete with these massive companies. And so if you think that, then support Web3, host, contribute, and follow, and help us and help everyone empower the next wave of internet innovation. Thank you.